Just give it a few more seconds. See people coming in. All right. Yeah. All right. It seems we are at the hour now, and we are very excited to have Professor Morgan Levy today. She's assistant professor at the Institution of Oceanography and the School of Global Policy and Strategy in the University of California, San Diego. She received PhD and Master's in Energy and Resources and Master's in Statistics from UC Berkeley. Her research focuses on understanding interactions between climate, water systems, and environmental and human health at global to local or at local to global scales. And she uses methods from hydrology, eco-hydrology, and applied statistics to do data-driven, policy-relevant research that connects climate to environmental and human health through water cycle processes. We are very excited to have her today to talk about interdisciplinary and data-driven approaches to understanding hydroclimate change. Without further ado, let's welcome Morgan, and the platform is yours, Morgan. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for that introduction, and I'm sorry to everyone that I wasn't able to make it in person. I'd originally planned to make the trip, and COVID gets in our way once again, so I apologize. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you all can see my presentation. And at this point, we should be good to go. Is that true? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Great. All right, so I'm Morgan. I'm from Scripps Institution of Oceanography, or SIO, and the Policy School at UCSD. Thanks for having me. I'm a relatively new assistant professor, and then generally today I'm going to be talking about research that falls under this category of interdisciplinary and data-driven approach to hydrology and hydroclimatology. So what I'll do is talk a little bit generally about what I mean by that. And then I'll go into a set of projects that are specific to the use of a relatively newer satellite data product that folks like me and those all over the world are using to explore water resources and specifically groundwater resources. So first, I'll do a little bit about me very, very briefly, just so you know where I'm coming from when I talk about this stuff. My primary interests are in all of the things that Mehdi discussed when he introduced me and gave me that very kind introduction. But basically, I got my PhD from an interdisciplinary environmental group at UC Berkeley. I did the master's in statistics, the PhD in that interdisciplinary group. Therein, during my PhD work and afterwards, I've focused primarily on these fields of physical hydrology, including eco-hydrology, more general environmental and earth system sciences, and then applied statistics and data analysis. And the research that I like to do is sort of on these water nexus themes. So anthropogenic change in water resources and the way different interactions happen between water and humans and things that humans use back and forth in two directions. And that tends to be research that falls under these categories that you hear that are these nexus ideas. So human water systems, land water systems, food water systems, things like that. Typically, when many people think about the water cycle, they think of the water cycle you see in these typical water cycle diagrams. This is where water evaporates off of the ocean or bodies of fresh water. Goes into the atmosphere and then comes back down to the land surface as precipitation, runs back into those same water bodies through rivers and streams, and then this cycle repeats. From the perspective of kind of thinking about human water systems, interdisciplinarity, and data, we can actually think about many different versions of the water cycle. So we think about the role of biological and ecological processes in the water cycle. One primary focus of that being vegetation. And this can be done at really large regional or global scales, or also down to really small, even individual plant scales. And that's typically kind of the origination and purview of this field of eco-hydrology that deals with plant-water interactions. Many water scientists today think specifically about the role of human modification in the water cycle. And the idea in this human water systems conceptualization is that hydrology comes from this study of physical hydrological processes. Many of those processes are grounded in this study of really pristine, unmodified environments. But, of course, those systems are disrupted by human activities. So hydrologists get into this position of needing to develop or adapt new methods for understanding systems and doing prediction. And that's where this human water systems idea comes from. Recently, the USGS, and some of you may have seen this, they issued an updated water cycle diagram. And the key thing here is there's a lot here. Obviously, hydrology is complex, but they inserted some key human modifications to that traditional water cycle. So two things that I'm pointing out in this diagram are just that we're seeing the effects of reservoirs within this water cycle, and then also some ideas surrounding urban runoff and municipal water use and industrial water use, including the role of groundwater within this larger kind of typically natural water cycle. I'm going to go through one example now of how we might think through water cycle interactions, specifically in a human modified environment. So for example, I'll talk about this kind of just very idealized wildfire and hydrology example. So we are all mostly aware that climate change has exacerbated some extremes in the hydroclimate. And in California in particular, that means flip-flopping between extreme heat or drought conditions and then extreme precipitation. And that can happen annually, it can happen subannually. And these alternating climatic conditions create this really ideal setting for wildfires, which we've all witnessed increasing over the past decade or so pretty noticeably and dramatically. And those wildfires also, in combination with the hydrology and ecohydrology, create really ideal conditions for there to be very dramatic subsequent hydrologic impacts after the wildfires. And I'll explain what this looks like in this cycle of human effects and hydrology. So first, for example, consider we might have a drought year. We have less precipitation, we have higher temperatures, we have less waters in rivers and creeks, with less incoming and flowing water. Soil moisture reserves dry up, the plants get water stressed, they're dry, they're brittle, they're susceptible to plant pathogens and pests, and with some kind of spark, could be natural or human caused, they become fuel for wildfire. On the flip side, imagine we see a wet year. It's a big year for atmospheric river events. We see a lot of precipitation, rivers fill up, reservoirs fill up, sometimes too much. There's lots of water in the soil and plenty of water for plants to grow and green up. Then on the flip side, once again, consider that we've come to the end of our water year, of our wet year, or even some multi-year wet year period, and we see this inevitable dry year or the drought period. Once again, we see reduced precipitation, reduced runoff in rivers, reduced soil moisture available for plants, and all that vegetation that grew during the wet period dries out, becomes wildfire fuel, and then large portions of it can burn in that next wildfire season. Now conditions flip again, and we see our next wet period, but post-fire things are pretty different than they were pre-fire. So in burned areas, a lot of the vegetation can be gone. It's not there to drink up the water when it is there. So fire can cause soils to become hydrophobic, which means they can repel water or crack. And under those conditions, the soils don't infiltrate precipitation as well, or they're infiltrating it differently. You get a lot of runoff over the land surface following a fire when rains do come, potentially through soil cracks, and that can move water very, very quickly through and over the land surface. So these are conditions under which you might then see flash floods, as well as debris flow and erosion. And this is very problematic from a human water management perspective. So the bigger story here is that, a fire happens in one place, but its hydrologic impacts can happen all the way downstream, much like the air pollution impacts of wildfire. And this becomes a much larger management and policy issue for states like California that are now dealing with this kind of a thing every year. And then it, on some measures, appears to be becoming even more extreme on both ends. Okay, so in the water sciences, you can ask all sorts of questions, sort of like these, like the example I just gave, or about the example I just gave, on interactions between humans and the water system in these stressed kind of anthropogenic change environments. So the figures you're seeing here on the right, at the top, you're seeing questions or images that relate to several threats to human health from hydroclimatic change, which can include things like vector-borne or waterborne diseases. And then those figures on the bottom are showing things like plant pathogens and water stress, which are related to outcomes like food insecurity and wildfire risk, like I just talked about, and those are exacerbated by climate change. In this kind of interdisciplinary human water systems world, there is typically, in terms of the science that folks do on this, some iteration between data and models. By models, I can be referring to an equation, a simple equation, or something more complex, many coupled equations. And by data, I just mean ways that we collect evidence or information about the world. That can be weather stations, it could be satellites, it could be physical observations that you make in your field work or in a survey. And then it can be things like census data or social survey designs, things like that. So there's all sorts of ways we might collect information on both the physical and the social side of these types of issues. The more typical use of data in the hydrology or the water science world is that we're using data as inputs to a process model or a prediction model. Instead, from a data-driven perspective, we can think about models as posing questions or hypotheses to be asked or tested using data. And this is actually more of a social science approach to research, in my opinion, and specifically when you see in some quantitative applied social science fields like political science, applied economics, even sociology. And the difference here is that we have, in the water sciences or for water questions, we actually have pretty relatively well-developed process models that represent something to the effect of the physics of these physical systems, from which we can develop hypotheses about how things should work in a human impacted system or not work in a human impacted system. And that makes kind of this models as hypotheses to be tested with data situation a bit easier in some regards than perhaps the social sciences. Okay, so today I'm going to highlight a newer project that builds on several previous projects that all focus on this use of a newer satellite data set for understanding surface water and groundwater in California, and specifically in the California agricultural sector. So this project that I'm talking about now, this is the title of this one subset, and this is work done with a incoming PhD student named Bei Chen at MIT. He was previously a master's student at UCSD. Wes Neely, also previously a PhD student at UCSD, now a postdoc at Stanford, and then my colleague at SIO, Adrian Borsa. And so on this team, we kind of have me, interdisciplinary water person. Wes and Adrian are both geophysicists. And the reason for that, it will become clear as I talk about this project. And then Bei Chen is a computer sciences student turned environmental scientist. So a pretty interdisciplinary group. Okay, so the data set I'm going to be talking about that we're using here is called surface displacement. Briefly describe what this means. Surface displacement is a measure of the vertical motion of the Earth. And when I say a positive displacement, that means uplift of the Earth. If I say negative displacement, that indicates subsidence. And this is referring, again, just to the up and down motion of the Earth's surface. In a place like the San Joaquin Valley, the Central Valley of California, specifically the Southern Central Valley of California, we have a system that many of you are probably well aware. We've seen subsidence. That subsidence is typically related to groundwater, in the sense that when groundwater is pumped in the summer to supplement or replace missing surface water supplies for agriculture, the water is removed from the soil, there's collapse of the pore spaces in the soil, there's then compression of the soils and the subsurface soils, and that causes subsidence. On the flip side, there is and can be some amount in certain conditions, there can be uplift when and if there is groundwater recharge and those pore spaces refill. It gets a lot more complicated than that, but that's the basic idea in terms of how a measure of vertical earth surface displacement can relate in some way to groundwater levels and groundwater pumping. Alternately, this story gets even more complex because the process I just described, where groundwater relates to surface displacement, only describes one of the effects that surface displacement is a result of, and it's called the poroelastic effect, which is just the effect of those pore spaces either emptying and collapsing and then filling and expanding. This other effect is related to just the generic compression and decompression of the entire surface and subsurface of the earth due to the mass of water that is present. More water means there's a bit of compression, less water in the summer means there's a bit of expansion. And the notable thing here is that these work in opposite. The compression and decompression, which is a mass loading effect due to water, you would see subsidence in winter in the southern Central Valley, and uplift in the summer. Alternately, if you have pumping, that subsidence happens in the summer, and any amount of uplift happens in the winter. The magnitudes of these things differ quite dramatically, but the displacement that we see, if you can measure it, it's the net of both of those things. So you don't necessarily need to fully understand that. I said that really fast. I just want to put it out there that the main picture here is that surface displacement, yes, related to water and specifically to groundwater levels, but it's very, very complex. So surface displacement is a proxy for groundwater, but it comes with complications. Displacement is determined by climate, the amount of water that's there, hydrology, where the water is, groundwater pumping, human activities, then soils and geology. So the physical processes that are underlying both groundwater levels and the displacement that we might see, they're connected, but they're not fully observed. The way that we see surface displacement is using a data product called interferometric synthetic aperture radar, or INSAR. And what INSAR does is it's mapping radar phase differences to land surface deformation, and it is corrected and validated using ground-based continuous GPS data. The product that we used in this particular project is a data set that actually the Department of Water Resources contracts an outside company to produce. So it's publicly available. You can just download it from the DWR makes a website available where you can download it. And what it is it measures sub-centimeter, so millimeter level vertical displacements. It does so, or the product that's made available is a 100-meter spatial resolution. That's a really fine spatial resolution relative to the other major satellite groundwater data source we have, which is GRACE. And that's around 300 kilometers. So that's like entire groundwater aquifers versus a gridded representation within a groundwater aquifer. And then you can actually acquire this at a weekly temporal resolution. For this project, we use the monthly temporal resolution, which is also the one that DWR makes available on their website. Okay, so previously, I'm not going to talk about the previous work. I'm just going to mention it briefly as a setup to what we're doing in our motivation. Previously, this group I work with at UCSD had done some work looking at how displacement or subsidence indicates groundwater pumping for agriculture. We looked at how this happens across different crop types, and specifically how subsidence varies over areas of land that are planted to different types of crops. We also looked at how the reverse of this, the uplift signal, indicates groundwater recharge and flow in certain parts of the valley. And specifically, you can really see this happening where surface water networks drain into the valley and presumably infiltrate and move through the valley. Okay, so altogether, these two pieces of work did, and what other people have really done really nice work on, is to establish that there's clearly some connection between groundwater processes and vertical surface displacements. However, it would be really great if we could actually directly relate these two. But again, as I mentioned, the processes are complex. It's pretty difficult. Okay, so the motivation between this project, or the most recent version of this attempt to use INSAR data, is that we want to link displacement and groundwater, but groundwater data are super limited, and the model, or if you want to think about it as the equation that links the two, is very complex and unknown. This motivates the use of a machine learning approach. And by that, I mean using a black box approach, where we want to use INSAR displacements, which are observed, to predict groundwater level change, which is only observed in very few locations. What we did was we looked at a few candidate machine learning models and data inputs. We then selected a specific machine learning model for further evaluation. And then second, we evaluated our selected model using groundwater level observations, and then also using estimates from some other outside, more kind of standard hydrologic modeling sources at the valley, the Central Valley scale. So what we found in this kind of preliminary experiment was that this displacement-driven machine learning model, the type of machine learning model it is a convolutional neural network, or a CNN model. Not super relevant to this talk. You can just think about it as this black box model. But we found that this model that we had selected, it generally outperformed models that were reliant on other data inputs. So data inputs other than displacement, and I'll talk about that briefly. And then it predicted groundwater level changes relatively well, and comparable to some more complex physical model-based estimates that we might typically use to look at groundwater change in the Central Valley. And again, I'll talk through all this, but this is the summary of what this particular more recent project is on these INSAR data. The groundwater level data that we're using, many of you might be familiar with it, or familiar with how sparse and difficult it is to work with. But this is the California Central Valley, and the data set we use to represent groundwater level change is from the Department of Water Resources periodic groundwater measurement data set. This is also just publicly available. And the point of the figures you're seeing here is that we've divided the valley up into three parts: northern, central, and southern. The northern Sacramento Valley, including Redding area, central San Joaquin River Valley, and then the southern Tulare Lake Basin. And what you're seeing here is just that there's disproportionately more observations, well observations in the north than there is in the center and the south. These are just showing the density of wells in these 4-kilometer grid cells that we've highlighted here just for visualization purposes. And then this bar chart down here in the bottom is just showing that most wells have 5 or less measured months of data, and very few wells have 60 months or a full year, a full 5 years of data. 5 years is the duration of the study that we used. So what we're trying to do, displacements are a measure of change in the vertical surface of the earth. And so what we're doing here is we're trying to map that change in the vertical surface to a change in groundwater levels. So our unit of measurement is this groundwater level change. We had to get a little bit creative about how we did this, because what we have from these well observations are just measures of the groundwater level. So what we did is we took any observations from these wells that were either 3 months or less apart, so that we were roughly approximating changes in within season well levels. So we took the difference between two groundwater level measurements. That's a groundwater level measurement change. We divided it by the number of days in there. We get an average millimeter per day groundwater level change within a variable set of observations. This is highly imperfect, but it is what we were able to go with for the purposes of this project. And it's, despite the sparsity of the information, it's kind of an interesting challenge for a machine learning model to take on and attempt to learn patterns in the relationship between displacement and groundwater levels in light of the sparsity of this information. Okay, so on the right, you're seeing the same figure, just showing the number of well locations within these 4-kilometer grid cells throughout the Central Valley. On the left, you're seeing just an average displacement millimeter per day within those same areas. The color bar here needs to get adjusted, but basically the blue is where you're having more average negative displacement, and then the gray is somewhere in this like very small less negative and or non-negative displacements. So you can see there's some extremes in the Central and Southern Valley in terms of average displacements, and then there's a lot of low magnitude non-negative or maybe even slightly positive values up in the center and northern part of the valley. But as you can see, this isn't something you can eyeball and say, okay, clearly average displacement. We will easily be able to map this using the well information because the provision of information is very poorly aligned. If you actually try and directly calculate the correlation between displacement and groundwater level change, that's the figure you're seeing in the center. And this is only showing cells where there was more than 5 months of data from which to calculate these correlations. And this doesn't look very clear. There's no clear, consistent pattern of correlation. Some have positive correlation, some have negative correlation. So we can kind of zoom out and try and estimate these correlations at a coarser spatial scale instead of these tiny little grid cells, and maybe understand a little bit more about what's going on. And if we do that using having this figure here, we actually made some constraints on the amount of data that we're willing to show here. These cells have to have more than 5 months of data. If we just use all the data, we group it by basins or subbasins, you can start to see these patterns in correlation that run from negative in the north down to, on average, positive in some parts of the Southern Central Valley. And what this is showing is it's showing that the northern parts, this negative correlation, the signal there is chiefly dominated by this earth surface compression or decompression, where you have a situation where more water results in kind of low-level subsidence. Whereas in the south, you have the flip situation where you have positive correlation, which just means that those systems are dominated instead, not by that loading effect, which is also present, but mostly by this groundwater pumping and recharge effect, which means that when there is more water, it's infiltrating and it's filling pore spaces, and that actually is resulting in uplift. We can look at this in a time series sense. So if we map the time series of groundwater level change in orange, and the magnitudes of those are on the left-hand side of these plots, and then the INSAR displacement in purple, which is on the right side here, we can go from the Northern Valley, Central Valley, Southern Valley. And you can see in the Northern Valley, they're very anti-correlated. That's where we get that negative correlation. In the San Joaquin Valley, it's still relatively negatively correlated, but it's a bit of a mixed signal. And then in the Tulare Lake Basin, where the Southern Valley, it sort of looks like a wash. We can't really tell what's going on there at all. The reason for that is that within those basins, we have subbasins, and those subbasins have different things going on. Some of them are more negatively correlated. Some of them are very positively correlated. So if we look at the Tule subbasin of the Tulare Basin, and we look at its time series with the limited number of wells that are available there to look at, we can see a more directly correlated signal, although there is a lag in that correlation. And that lag has actually been observed by a lot of people at this point. There's some lag between these well levels and INSAR displacements on average. Okay, so given the complexity of this situation, we can see that there are relationships. However, the relationships are really regionally varied. There are different dynamics going on in different places. We have some sense of the geophysical explanation of why that is, but this sort of sets up a very interesting situation and challenge for a machine learning model, asking it to go ahead and learn what these patterns are from sparse data given we're asking it to learn things from sparse data that are also very complicated. So a fun project to challenge a data-driven model with. Okay, so we're back to our machine learning model. I'm going to go through what this model is, but again, if this doesn't make sense or you don't know what these are, it shouldn't be relevant. Again, just think about it as a black box model, as some equation. Okay, so our candidate models, we use 3 different types of models, ridge regression and k-nearest neighbors. Those are relatively simple machine learning models. And then a convolutional neural network, which is a more complex, sophisticated machine learning model. The displacement inputs, so the things we're feeding into the model to get it to predict groundwater level change, we have a temporal dimension and we have a spatial dimension. And I won't go into the details of this unless people have specific questions, but basically, if you have a given well observation, so when we're training the model to know what a groundwater level change will be or predict what it will be, imagine you have a measurement of a groundwater level change in a particular location. In order to predict that, what it's going to do is it's going to look at the 12 months of land surface displacement around the time of that observation, 5 months before, 1 month during, and 6 months after. So it's surrounding, it's the time before and after. And that has to do with the fact that we're unsure about the physical mechanism that might be related to displacement and groundwater level change at a different place. And the timing of it will be different, whether or not you're in the north or in the south, and whether or not it's dominated by that mass loading effect or dominated by a groundwater pumping effect. The spatial dimension means that around the location of a well where we're trying to predict a groundwater level change, we are taking 100-meter displacement pixels from around that well, 4 kilometers around that well, and basically sampling the quantiles or the percentiles of those observations around the well. Both of those dimensions are fed into the model, and that's what we're using to predict groundwater level change. We also looked at different inputs to see if they would predict groundwater level change similar to displacement. Those were precipitation, evapotranspiration, just raw land surface reflectance bands from Landsat 8, including the land surface temperature band. So this is just to try different data products and say, you know what, is INSAR special? Is displacement special in being able to predict groundwater levels, or is it just giving a model a bunch of data that has information about things on the Earth's surface, the part of this that helps do this? And then for anyone interested in machine learning models, the CNN architecture that we used was a very standard kind of canned version of a very old standard CNN model. And we didn't tweak the model or try to find the best model in this case. We're actually just trying to benchmark the performance of INSAR displacement relative to other data inputs as a sort of baseline performance metric for how this data set might be used in a machine learning context to look at groundwater level change. Okay, so one of the main things that we did at the end of the day was we looked at what our model predicted versus some other sources of information that are about groundwater level change in the Central Valley. So what you're seeing here is a time series of our trained convolutional neural network model and what it predicted in terms of groundwater level change at a 4-kilometer cell resolution across the entire Central Valley. So the purple line is our model's predictions of groundwater storage change. We actually converted our groundwater level change to groundwater storage change in order to be able to compare it to other data sources or other model prediction sources. And the purple bars around it is just the interquartile range of observations or predictions across the entire valley. In the orange, this is a numerical groundwater model that's developed for practitioner usage throughout the Central Valley. And it's called C2V Sim. And the orange line is what that model is predicting as groundwater storage change over this 5-year study period. WB stands for water balance. It's a simple water balance, or ins minus outs equals change. And that is in the blue line here. And you can see that the C2V Sim and the water balance track each other pretty closely, but our model predictions are similar to some extent in magnitude, a little bit kind of represents some more extreme magnitudes. But namely, the point here is that the traditionally modeled groundwater storage change is both delayed and then slightly attenuated relative to our machine learning modeled groundwater storage change. Which is right? It's sort of a complicated question. What we can do is we can compare our machine learning model based estimates to actual measurements of groundwater levels that we used in the first place to train the model, or specifically, we can compare it to a set of groundwater level measurements that we held out, did not include in the model training, to see how closely our CNN model, that's our machine learning model, actually represents groundwater level change relative to groundwater level measurements. So again, this figure you're seeing here is this metric of valley-wide groundwater, total groundwater storage, and the change in total groundwater storage. And that's done with a numerical groundwater model, and then also just purely with water balance accounting, precipitation, evapotranspiration, flow. Here, what we're looking at on the right is our CNN model, the machine learning model in purple, compared to well observations from that DWR data set, the same data set from which data was used to train this model. So you can go ahead and focus on this observation here on the left. These are any wells. The wells included in our data set were both irrigation and observation wells. Typically, you would only use observation wells because they won't be affected by pumping and therefore cones of depression. We actually just use both of them in our model. But the differences between them are these lighter scaled ones are just the observation wells. There's not huge differences, although there are some differences. But the main takeaway here is that the machine learning modeled groundwater storage change is actually matching the timing and the magnitude of precise well observations. So this lag that we see here indicates that our machine learning model is learning something different than these physical models. It's learning something that pertains to kind of precise groundwater level changes that can be mapped to groundwater storage changes. This isn't to say that C2V sim and a water balance are wrong. It's just these things are presumably actually representing different entities, even though the metric, this groundwater storage change, is different. This is the sort of what I wanted to cover broad scale about this particular project. And I only have a little bit of time left, but I'll take questions at the end about this. But I also wanted to briefly touch on the way that we're using this INSAR data set in another location, which might be interesting to some other folks who are interested in groundwater issues that aren't Central Valley, but are instead coastal. So I will briefly mention that, but I'm happy to talk about this project as well, as I know I brushed over many details in an attempt to kind of tell the overarching story. But I'm now briefly going to switch to another INSAR project, just so those of you that have coastal interests, as a lot of people at SIO happen to, might be interested in. Okay, so we are also looking at the use of INSAR in coastal settings. This is a different project with a couple PhD students at SIO, Lauren Kim and Lainey Wicker, and then a colleague at the Naval Postgraduate School, Mara, and then Sarah Giddings and Mark Merrifield from SIO. And those are my colleagues at SIO. They're on the ocean and estuary side of things. But basically, this is another unique agricultural river basin and region in California, kind of north central coast. So we're moving from the California Central Valley over the coastal range into the coast. And what we have here is a largely, it is an agricultural valley. It's a different type of agricultural valley. This one happens to not receive any state or federal water project deliveries. So they're actually entirely, almost exclusively reliant on a coastal groundwater aquifer and some limited surface water supplies. Oops, sorry, I've got a pop-up here that's in my way. Okay. Who's there? In this area, the water management agency that deals with kind of water management for this local set of agricultural producers is the Pajaro Valley Water Management Agency. and then also dealing with some of the estuary and water management issues pertaining to Watsonville, which is the county of Santa Cruz. And the issue here is that they also pump groundwater. They also have groundwater subsidence, but their problem, in addition, they have kind of a joint problem here, is that not only is groundwater pumping bringing down the water tables and threatening freshwater supply in their area, if and when they pump down their groundwater aquifers, they get salt water from the ocean that moves in to take the place of the fresh water that's pumped out. It's kind of it's a slower moving process, but this has been ongoing for decades in this area. They've had a saltwater intrusion problem for a very long time. And this particular area is kind of an interesting case study in groundwater management because they've been groundwater threatened for a very, very long time, but have had the need to actually proactively address that groundwater withdrawal and water table level decline proactively, because they face this double threat, not only of having to pump deeper and deeper, but also because pumping deeper and deeper pollutes their water. So they've actually implemented all sorts of groundwater management strategies, things that a lot of the other Central Valley agricultural water districts are now only starting to implement in light of the new groundwater management legislation. And these folks did it long before. So it's an interesting case study. The question here, though, is can we use INSAR in the same way? Can we use INSAR to understand groundwater change in this region, given there's a saltwater intrusion issue? So this is a different situation, because in this case, on the pumping side, if you have groundwater levels that are being pumped in a kind of inland scenario, you might have compression because the water is moving out of the groundwater aquifer pores, the soil's compressing, and then the land subsides. Here, you move water out of those pore spaces and salt water starts to move in. So kind of from a very simplistic perspective, we might expect to not see subsidence in the land surface, or we might expect to see subsidence inland of the saltwater intrusion line, but not along the areas that actually have saltwater intrusion. So some interesting questions here that go beyond the use of just INSAR for groundwater level change. We're also wondering what INSAR might tell us in areas that have saltwater intrusion. There's a lot of coastal aquifers. Coastal aquifers are pretty dramatically understudied, and they tend to be managed very differently than one another from place to place. So we've begun some preliminary explorations in this area. This coastal aquifer does not experience long-term subsidence. So here we're sort of looking here for signals that are very, very small scale relative to stuff we see in the Central Valley. So seasonal or long-term variations that are orders of magnitude smaller in terms of displacement along this coastal region than they would be in the Central Valley. And that's why in this picture, what you're seeing is a visualization of those 100-meter displacements, but in terms of an anomaly. So what these are deviations from a regional median value in terms of the land moving up or down on average. The main takeaway here in terms of this picture is just that we can actually see some positive anomalies, positive deviations from kind of a medium range mean or median value in areas that are connected to the surface water drainage network, and kind of average negative anomalies along this coast here, although there are significant missing values. What we're doing here is we're poking around using data from this local water management agency, which has provided us with a lot of their data for the purposes of exploring this question, and asking if we're seeing different patterns at different locations, such as at an inland creek versus a coastal well location. And we do see pretty different patterns. This is the cumulative, so long-term cumulative change or long-term cumulative displacement anomalies, so deviations from an average between 2016 and 2019. You see some movement upward here, and then a seasonal signal. Whereas in the inland creek, that pattern looks very different. Again, these magnitudes are super, super tiny, but we're interested here in not the extent to which displacement might map to certain levels of water pumped or not pumped, but instead whether or not it represents, to some extent, the way water is actually moving around spatially in this coastal basin, and whether that can tell us anything about the extent of groundwater intrusion. I'm going to stop there so that I can take questions, because I know that was pretty dense. But thank you all for bearing with me, and I will take questions now.
Thank you, Morgan. Thank you very much. Very interesting, very challenging, and also very timely. So I don't see any questions in the chat box, so I will try to throw some questions.
Sure.
Maybe they will trigger some responses. So my first question is something that I wanted to ask even in the middle of your presentation, but I decided to behave. When you talk about, I mean, in your presentation, in the first two projects that you described, you talked about predicting ground level water, predicting displacement.
Right.
And actually, what I would like to ask is, in the process of predicting ground level water, did you take into account behavioral aspects of those who pump the water, or did you just look at the level of the water that was after a decision to pump and use was made?
Because, so in this,
let me just add one or two more sentences. And the question, we are in a school of public policy, and science is important, and data-based observations are the most valuable asset for a good policy. But the question is, if you can add a little bit, maybe it is outside of the project, but maybe you can add a little bit of your opinion on what kind of policies could be suggested to either to the California Department of Water Resources or to the local managing agency of that aquifer, in order to maybe to regulate better the trajectory of water changes in the aquifer. So actually, two questions. One, I think that is about whether or not in your predictions, you incorporated also behavioral aspects. And the second one, what kind of regulatory efforts you may predict, or not predict, but assess as possible?
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. Yeah, the deal with the machine learning model and the way that we set this up is, no, we actually don't account for or include any prescribed process in the model at all. We don't include a physical process. We don't include behavioral processes. We don't include anything. It's just saying, here is INSAR displacement. Here is groundwater levels. Find an iterative mapping from one to the other, where you're, quote, algorithmically learning the relationship between the two, not what causes the relationship between the two. So this is where, like physical models or a behavioral model are useful in the sense that you actually say, okay, well, I think the causal mechanism is X, and then you can test whether or not that actually pans out. Here, we're saying we don't know what the causal mechanism is. It could be one thing in one place. It could be a different thing in another place. All we're saying is that the data has this relationship. Can we predict the relationship accurately? And so that's the issue that where we don't actually account for anything in this model. We're just focused on prediction. And that's interesting in the sense that for this model, it's very unsophisticated. We haven't fed it anything or any information other than just here's displacement. And here's what groundwater looks like at the places where you measure these displacements. The thing we did in this particular study that I didn't talk about was after the prediction, the one thing we did try to do was divide up the model predictions by different spatial units that pertain to pieces of information that are relevant. So we can divide up what the model predicts in different basins or different subbasins and see if the model predicts better, if it predicts worse. And then we can ask what features of that area may have caused it to predict better or worse. Was it well depth? Was it well type? Was it the geology of the area? Was it the number of pumpers in the area? So it's sort of a post-prediction analysis, but it is a way to look at and ask maybe, did this model predict better or worse in this particular location? Because the features of that location are related to things of interest. I can show you one table to kind of make this at least, I guess, like partially clear here. Not that one, this one. So basically one of the stratifications we predicted, and then we looked at whether or not the model, how it performed differently in the 3 different basins. And then with respect to the well type. So, does it predict better over irrigation wells versus observation wells? Observation wells are just there for observation. The irrigation wells are actually the pumping, active agricultural pumping. And then we were asking, are there differences in the depth of the well? So areas is it better predicting at wells that are deeper? Is it better predicting at wells that are shallower? We found some interesting things there. We have some interesting thoughts about why some of these things might be occurring. These values here are just the R squared. They're quite low throughout until you aggregate up to the basin level. But from a machine learning perspective and a benchmarking perspective, we're actually just looking at how these things cross compare. It's a relative analysis rather than an absolute. But this is the extent to which we're looking at causal mechanisms. We're just predicting with this machine learning model and then saying, okay, what things about the performance indicate that certain things might be the reason this is performing this way? And that's a factor of this not being a model that accounts for anything other than this raw data relationship. And this relates to your second question, even though I
but before you
fully
move to
answered your
the
first
question,
question.
let me introduce a very similar question that was asked by Christy Christman, and maybe you can add a little bit more. So the question is, based on what you are seeing, what types of water management policies changes do you think we should be examining for being able to meet our needs as a state?
Yeah, so I think we're not there yet. And the reason, so I think I'll answer your second question and then it'll make sense, probably my response to this third question. The second question is, how would we even use this? So the way that we would use this is typically the way that we use. So this is part of why I showed this plot here, or specifically this one on the left. We use both of these both of these are used in the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. They're both used in SGMA. The GSAs use these. The groundwater sustainability agencies wrote and are writing groundwater sustainability plans. In those plans, they have to generate water budgets for their groundwater. These are the tools they use for that. These tools appear to produce estimates that at a valley-wide scale, we could chop this up into sub units, which we have not done yet. We've only done this cursory valley-wide exercise. We could chop these up into smaller units and say, effectively, we know that this model, this data-driven model, maps groundwater level changes to using displacement pretty accurately in many locations. if what the districts are using or the GSA's groundwater sustainability agencies are using are these two tools, and these two tools are producing estimates of groundwater storage change that are actually lagged, or maybe representing different pieces of information. They're not representing groundwater levels, they're representing change in broad scale storage, which is occurring on a different time scale. That's relevant to the execution of this policy, because it's potentially what we're doing is we're providing a similar or comparable or compatible source of information in terms of groundwater level change that GSAs could use to meet their objectives that they have for sustainability. This is not saying that we shouldn't be using these. It's saying that this is another source of information that could be used alongside these kind of larger scale estimates that we use with water budget accounting or a numerical groundwater model. The thing here, though, is that a machine learning model that simply maps displacement to groundwater level change, if it's actually reasonably accurate, it is much, much easier and much less costly. So that's the kind of value add here in terms of the policy, is that this information is already being used to meet the obligations that the agricultural users have within existing policy. And they're going to need to be using it for the next 20 plus years to meet the obligations that they need to meet. But these two methods are exceptionally costly and complicated and difficult to implement. Also, for example, implementing C2V SIM in your basin using the data that you have, things start to veer in the direction of being an art rather than a science, because there's a lot of parameters to those models, and there can be good information, there can be bad information. So this sort of presents a nice complementary data set for those that is pretty model and data collection agnostic. The only thing it uses is displacement and groundwater levels. So it's sort of an interesting case where, data-driven and statistics and machine learning, it can sound complicated, but if you're a physical scientist that's seen any of these physical accounting mechanisms or physical models, they're actually much more complex. So this is perhaps something that's actually able to generate information on groundwater level changes that's a little bit easier to digest on the user side, and a little easier to implement and less costly to implement for the purposes of actually meeting the requirements of existing policy, let alone creating new policy. I would say that the value here to policy is that this is a complementary data product that might actually be more legible to many users. Yeah.
We have one more question, probably the last question, because we have 2 more minutes and we don't want to see a flood of people leaving. So here it is. Are the information and the models currently used locally? And also it is related to what you just said, locally, or are there any plans to take these to a state level?
So right now it's just over the Central Valley. And the reason for that is just that these, the well information we have is largely a data set that's collected to support. I mean, the wells we have are statewide. We only use the Central Valley. And the reason for that is this produced INSAR data set that DWR contracts Trey Altamira to produce only does it over water, basically basins in California, and it doesn't do it over all of California. It actually only contracts them to produce it over the Central Valley and some of the agricultural water districts along the coast and in the outside of the valley. So it's not done statewide. Our group at SIO has produced our own INSAR measurements. You can produce your own INSAR measurements. Presumably you could do this anywhere, but right now the direct usage of this would just be kind of in the service of a kind of this California Sustainable Groundwater Management Plan, which has certain mandates and certain data products that are made available to users.
Okay. Mehdi, you have the right of closure.
Perfect. I didn't type my question, but one last question, and that relates to a joint project I have with REO. Is there a reason you use 6 months before the land displacement data set, because I'm not the expert here. I'm learning about displacement data sets, and I thought it's really a long-term sort of impact. So I just want to hear a little bit more about that. And then the second one, is there a working paper or a report that we can access to this?
Yes. So the 6 months before, 6 months after, if we had more high resolution groundwater level data, this was a little bit about fitting a square peg into a round hole. So taking the data that we did have at the resolution it was, and finding the best way to cram it into the inputs for the machine learning model. The groundwater level measurements are so sparse that basically, we played around with this substantially in the design of the model. You can do it more narrow, you can do it wider. It just sort of changes the numbers of observations you're actually giving to the model to use to relate to the groundwater levels. If you had really high resolution, high temporal resolution groundwater level measurements, you could do much less, because you can get INSAR up to weekly. So you could presumably, if the groundwater level data were better, you could limit the time frame. There's the flip side argument of this, which is that some displacement, specifically some subsidence, is very long term. So there's some subsidence, if you have a dramatic pumping event and dramatic subsidence, that subsidence from that single drawdown event can last years potentially. So there's some other, in some cases, the timescales of these things can be really different. There's the instantaneous stuff, there's the long-term stuff, but you could ideally, like without data constraints, you could engineer this whatever way you wanted to, depending on your specific question.
Right. Thanks very much.
Yeah, and then the working paper, yes, there's a paper right now. We're trying to get it out as a preprint ASAP, but anyone is welcome to individually contact me. And I can ask Beichen, who is the PhD student lead author, if he's comfortable sharing a version for review. We've shared it with a few people at this point, but hopefully this will be up in preprint while it's submitted within a few weeks, so that hopefully folks can just look at it.
Perfect. Thanks very much. This is very exciting, very timely project, and good luck with all these different but very policy-oriented projects. Yeah, we were very lucky to have you today. We wish you were in person, but maybe some other time. And we wish you speedy recovery. And for the attendees, thanks very much for attending the seminar. Morgan's information is on the website also, and this presentation is recorded and will be up in our waterdialogue.ucr.edu website if you want to watch and if you want to contact Morgan. And our next seminar will be on December 6th. We have a Met General Manager to talk about the efforts they are doing for the drought management in Southern California. Again, thank you all for attending, and thanks Morgan for participating in our seminar series.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Morgan. Good luck.
Bye.
Say hi to Dan.
Will do.
Bye-bye.